Bom dia a todos e todas. Bom dia, professor SIEGRIST. Johannes SIEGRIST é professor emérito de Sociologia Médica do Centro de Saúde e Sociedade da Universidade HEINRICH-HEINE de Düsseldorf, Alemanha, onde também atuou como professor sênior de 2012 a 2021. A sua principal linha de pesquisa é sobre os determinantes sociais de saúde, com foco nos ambientes psicossociais do trabalho. Ele atuou como presidente e membro de grupos de trabalhos internacionais, como da OMS, OIT e OCDE, e foi presidente da Sociedade Internacional de Medicina Comportamental e da Sociedade Europeia de Sociologia da Saúde e Medicina. Foi membro da Academia Europeia, membro correspondente da Academia de Ciências de Heidelberg e recebeu o Prêmio de Realização de Vida da Associação Internacional de Medicina Comportamental. Em 1996, o professor Johannes elaborou um modelo de avaliação de estressores ocupacionais, que é um dos modelos mais utilizados para avaliar o ambiente psicossocial do trabalho, o modelo desequilíbrio, esforço, recompensa. Então, é dele o questionário ERI, traduzido e validado no Brasil. Há muitos anos que o NEP vem utilizando esse modelo, que tem se revelado um excelente instrumento para identificar estressores ocupacionais e sua relação com desfechos na saúde e na saúde mental. A produção do professor é vasta e tem influenciado a elaboração de políticas públicas em várias partes do mundo, com influência de documentos da OMS e OIT. Das suas produções recentes, destaco o seu livro mais recente, publicado em 2024, que recomendo a todos e todas conhecerem, Psychosocial Occupational Health and Interdisciplinary Textbook, que ele escreveu junto com o Jean Lee. As temáticas atuais abordadas no livro incluem discussões sobre crise climática e ambiente psicossocial do trabalho. É uma excelente fonte de evidências acadêmicas, trazendo conhecimentos relevantes para transformar o mundo do trabalho no desafio de torná-lo mais decente, sustentável e saudável. O professor Johannes é também um exímio violinista, tendo um grupo de cordas e sendo também músico da Orquestra Sinfônica de Düsseldorf. Afora todas essas inúmeras habilidades, é uma pessoa humana incrível, amorosa, generosa e colaborativa, sempre pronto a nos acompanhar nos territórios, às vezes acidentados, da produção científica qualificada e da intervenção. Obrigada, professor Johannes, por ter me recebido, colaborado com o nosso trabalho e está sempre disponível, como ele está disponível agora para estar aqui conosco. O Núcleo de Epidemiologia, que é o nosso grupo de pesquisa, tem ganhado muito com a colaboração do professor Johannes. Johannes, it's a pleasure to be here with us today. The word is yours.
Thank you very much. Dear audience, dear colleagues, and dear TÄNIA and ARAÚJO, it is an honor to participate in your meeting today. And I thank you for this opportunity. I very much appreciate your activity as National Observatory on Mental Health and Work, as this is a crucial approach towards improving the Brazilian population's mental health well-being. If we talk on this topic, it is important to distinguish three aspects, and it would be nice to have the first slide of my presentation.
It's okay? Can you see?
Okay? Yes, and the next one. If we talk about mental health, it is important to distinguish three aspects. First, we can say mental well-being is a state of positive affect, of energy and engagement, of positive social and psychological functioning. This want to have many people as far as possible to experience mental well-being. However, large parts of the population suffer from mental health problems. And this term means that these people suffer from a range of disturbed mental well-being, but this disturbance is at the subclinical level of symptoms. It includes negative affect, disengagement, exhaustion, and burnout. However, more serious is the third aspect if we talk about mental disorders. These are clinically defined conditions of symptoms deserving treatment, and these symptoms are defined by diagnostic manuals. And most important are depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, and also schizophrenia. In my talk, I will focus on depressive disorders for the following reasons. Next slide, please. Next. Yes. Depressive disorders are a serious condition of mental and physical health, and they are a global challenge. As you can see, depression has a far-reaching impact on the global burden of disease, because depression and cardiovascular diseases are two globally leading causes of premature mortality and of disability-adjusted life years without disability. The frequency, the prevalence of mental disorders is quite high. For instance, talking about the prevalence during 1 year, during 12 months, it has been estimated to be about 17.6% at the global level, and in Latin America it has been estimated to be even higher, more than 22%. We can also estimate the lifetime prevalence, how many people experience depression at least once in their life. And as you can see, there are almost 30% globally and even 33% in Latin America. Now, depressive disorders are particularly relevant for working age populations because a high incidence of depression has been demonstrated in early adulthood. And depression goes along with long sickness absence, with unemployment, and with early exit from paid work. This condition produces significant productivity losses due to recurrent episodes and due to the chronic nature of this disease. Moreover, those who are depressed have an elevated risk of suffering from other conditions, in particular cardiovascular diseases metabolic diseases, and unfortunately, the risk of suicide is significantly elevated among people with serious depression. Now, my professional background is sociology, and for social sciences as well as for public health people, it is very important to show that depression is unequally distributed across society. There is a higher burden of this depression among those with lower educational degrees, with lower occupational positions, and with lower income, what we call lower socioeconomic groups. If we compare the relative risk of suffering from a depression between someone in the lowest compared to someone in the highest socioeconomic group, the relative risk is more than twice as high in the lowest compared to the highest group. And among women, the risk is even greater. It is about 4.5 times higher in the lower compared to the higher socioeconomic group. So it is an issue for prevention and health policy. Next. How can we explain this social inequality of depression? Actually, there are three approaches, and they complement each other. The first approach says, well, this is mainly due to the fact that poor people, less educated people, have fewer access to health care, have access to poor quality of health care, and they have less opportunity to adhere to preventive measures. This is already a serious condition, and I don't know the details of the Brazilian healthcare system, to what extent there are differences in access to healthcare according to people's education and financial background. A second explanation concerns health-related behaviors, and many studies have shown that those with lower education suffer from worse health-related behaviors. For instance, poor nutrition, lack of physical exercise, more alcohol consumption, more cigarette smoking, and also drug consumption. So there are inequalities in health-related behaviors. The third explanation posits that there are differences in stressful psychosocial environments during the life course between those with less versus more privileged social conditions. And impressive research has shown that this inequality starts already during pregnancy and in early childhood. There are also studies showing that poor people have less social connections. They are more socially isolated and lonely. But very important, inequalities in working life, inequalities in the employment conditions and in the quality of work are a major determinant of social inequalities in health, and in particular in depression. And in my talk, I will simply focus on this third aspect of inequalities in working life. Next. So the aims of my structure are twofold. First, I want to discuss with you how working conditions and their unequal distribution contribute to the development of depression. And I also want to show how current scientific knowledge on these associations can be used for the promotion of healthy work. So my lecture will have 3 parts. In a very short first part, I will talk about the psychosocial dimension of modern work and its effects on health. This is a huge topic, and I apologize that I won't have time to go into more details. For those of you who are interested, for instance, we have recently published a book on psychosocial occupational health as an interdisciplinary textbook, which has been published by Oxford University Press last year, and there you can find all the many details on this topic. However, in the second part, I will provide evidence on the importance of working conditions for the development of depression, drawing on most recent scientific studies. And the most important part of my presentation will be number 3. What are the implications of this new knowledge for the intervention, for the promotion of healthy work? Next. As mentioned, in modern work, psychosocial work environment plays a major role. Why? Because with the transformation from the industrial sector to the service sector and to information and communication technology jobs, including automation, including the psychomental and social-emotional job tasks in the service sector, this dimension becomes highly prevalent and highly relevant. The quality of these psychosocial work environments is also unequal across the social structure. It is worse among those in lower positions, as I will show in a minute. More psychosocial work adversely affect the health of workers, and I will show this for depression as the main health outcome. It is important to mention that these psychosocial non-material conditions at work, they affect the workers not through material toxic substances, but through sensory input to the brain. So it is the brain and it is the stress-induced input on the body which matters most. For us in science, it is a main challenge to identify what particular features within the psychosocial work environment is responsible for poor health. How can we identify out of the complexity of modern work these specific conditions which lead to increased risks of illness? And if we have identified them, how can we measure them? And how can we demonstrate that they have adverse effects on mental health? So these are real challenges. With the next slide, I will show how we can identify psychosocial work environments with elevated risk of depression. An approach you are all familiar with, this approach, is to try to find occupations and professions with a high risk of depression. A few months ago, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, a study was published which found that several occupations have the highest prevalence of depression in the US American working population over the last few years. And you can see that there are professions and occupations such as community and social workers, healthcare workers, in particular nurses and health support personnel, but also artists, freelancers, media workers, those working in leisure time conditions. A very important, highly stressed group is profession are people dealing with personal care and personal services, and in particular care for older people. And there is also a risk for those involved in food preparation and food delivery in the service of food and drinking. However, I don't think this is a very helpful approach, simply looking at professions and occupations for three problems, for three reasons. First, we don't know how we can generalize this information. Are there common elements between these different occupations? How can we say that, for instance, a nurse, a specific group, is at risk and another group of nurses is not at risk? Where is the threshold of risk? And further, how can we explain the link between these professions and depression? So, in my view, this is not very helpful. Let's look for a second approach. Next. The second approach is to develop and to apply a theoretical model to identify relevant psychosocial work environments with the help of a theoretical model. Now, what is a theoretical model? Such a model selects distinct elements, distinct features out of the complex work environments, and these elements are defined at the high level of abstraction, because we want to apply them to a large variation of different occupations. And these elements in a theoretical model should have an explanatory function, because they show how work experience can be linked with a health outcome. And to this aim, we have the so-called stress theory, a biopsychosocial and biopsychological stress theory, and I will briefly come back to this. So, a theoretical model specifies interactions between these elements in terms of hypotheses, and it proposes that these hypotheses can predict health outcomes. Now, if a theoretical model is successful, then it can instruct the design and the implementation of healthy work interventions, and at the end of my talk I will show how specific models can be applied for health promotion within organizations of work and employment. Next. So there are several different theoretical models of the psychosocial work environment and its effects on health, but three models have been studied most often during the last 30 years. And these three models are related to three pictures. To the left you can see a picture showing job tasks. In the middle you can see a model showing an exchange at work, because work is also an exchange with what you give and what you receive in turn. And on the right-hand side, you can see the idea of justice within the organization of work. And below you can see three disease conditions which were most often related to psychosocial work environments. On the left-hand side, depression. In the middle, coronary heart disease. And on the right-hand side, musculoskeletal disorders. In my talk, I will focus on mental disorders and in particular depression. And I will focus on the first two slides, the left and the middle, because these two models were most often studied in so-called prospective epidemiologic cohort studies. Now let's have a closer look at these two models. Next. The demand control model has its focus on job task profiles, and I will show in the next slide how exactly this model is constructed. The model that we have developed, which is a complementary, not an alternative, but a complementary model, has its focus on the work contract. And the third model on organizational injustice has its focus on unfair procedures and interactions at work. Now let's see more closely how these two models, demand control and effort reward imbalance, have been constructed. Next, please. Now, the demand control model, which has been proposed several decades ago by an American sociologist, Robert Kurasek, and which has been further developed together with a Swedish cardiologist and epidemiologist, Therese Tyrell, is quite simple because it consists only of two dimensions of the job task. If a job task profile is defined by high demands, in particular high work pressure, high psychological demands, and at the same time by a low degree of control, a low degree of decision latitude, and this is the lowest quarter on the right-hand side in this diagram, the so-called high strain condition. If this happens, then, according to this model, people have an elevated risk of developing a stress-related disorder. Next. So, the core hypothesis of this model is that high demand, in combination with low control, generates sustained stress responses with longer-term disease risk. And this is important because the experience of threats to control or loss of control at work, this activates the so-called stress axis in our organism, which means that stress hormones like cortisol, adrenaline, and noradrenaline are secreted in the organism, and the whole organism is activated for an extended time. So continued stress can damage the organism. It can predict increased risk of cardiovascular disease, of metabolic disease, and also of mental health risks such as depression. There is not only evidence from epidemiologic studies, but also from experimental and quasi-experimental research. It is important to mention that this model can be measured by a simple questionnaire which has been tested in terms of psychometric properties, and we can say that after 30 or 40 years of research, many independent studies have shown that this model can predict stress-related disease. Next. These are the two stress axes which are activated if people lose control or if their control to accomplish a task is threatened. And you can see that in the brain, in particular in the hypothalamus, that there are releasing hormones, that there are neuroendocrine pathways which activate substances in the adrenal cortex, in the adrenal medulla, and also in the peripheral sympathetic, such that the organism is activated for a longer time beyond what is normally expected. Now the next slide shows the effort-reward imbalance model. As you can see from the picture, this is the imbalance between a high demand of efforts. In the left hand you can see effort is very high, so it goes down on the wage, and the rewards which are expected and which have been promised for the effort spent are not adequate. They are not high enough, they are too low, or they are even lacking. And it is important, and this model distinguishes three dimensions of reward. The financial dimension of wage and salary, the status-related dimension of mobility and job security, and the social-emotional dimension of recognition and esteem. As you can see, this model is a little bit more complex than the demand control model because it does not only look at the situation at work, it also looks at the working person. And the working person can also contribute to this imbalance between high work effort and low reward. For instance, there are some people which do more than what is expected. They do more than 100%. They are, as we say, they are overcommitted, maybe for psychological reasons, so they contribute themselves to this imbalance. However, in my talk I will mainly focus on the situational components of this model. Next. So the core hypothesis is that the joint manifestation of high effort and low reward generates this sustained stress response with longer-term disease risk. And again, there is a clear link to the psychobiological stress theory, as you will see in the next slide. Explanatory contributions has also been shown, and this measure again, this theoretical model again is measured by a standardized questionnaire with assessed quality criteria, and actually ARAÚJO has been very, very successful in translating the ERI questionnaire, together with other groups also, into the Brazilian language. So there is quite a lot of evidence on this model as well. The next slide shows you the brain, and it shows you in the brain. Next slide, please. And in the brain there are areas which are called the so-called limbic structures. And these limbic structures, like insula and amygdala, they are crucial for reward transmission, and also for lack of reward, for reward deficiency, for deception of reward. So like physical pain, they activate stress responses as emotional pain. Next slide, please. We said in the beginning, depression is more prevalent among those with lower socioeconomic positions. And this has been shown, among others, in a very powerful European study. This is the study with results from the European Working Conditions Survey in 15 European countries. And this survey collected data from 1995 to 2015. And for the demand control model, which is also often mentioned, the so-called job strain model. Data are available for all the 20 years until 2015. And you can see that the low-skilled manual workers, this is the blue line at the highest group here, that they have throughout every wave of survey have the highest amount of work stress in terms of high demand and low control. On the right-hand side, you can see that at least since 2005, the effort-reward imbalance model was also included in this European Working Conditions Survey. And you can see that in 2010, in 2015, there's a clear social gradient. Those with low-skilled manual workers have the highest amount of effort-reward imbalance, and those with high-skilled clerical jobs, they have the lowest. And in between, you see a social gradient for the two work stress models. Next slide. So we look for evidence how this work stress affects the risk of depression. And there are two study designs for this kind of research. Most important are so-called prospective epidemiological cohort studies. These are large groups of employed relevant men who at the baseline are not yet diseased, that they are healthy, at least with regard to, for instance, to depression or to coronary heart disease. And then they are followed up over time, and their work stress is measured at the beginning. And in the follow-up, we look whether those with high levels of work stress at the beginning have an elevated risk of stress-related disorders over time. The second approach is so-called naturalistic studies, where in real-time investigations at the workplace during the workday, biological data are collected and are correlated with the work stress experience. So this is the so-called ambulatory monitoring approach, which is an important additional source of evidence for stress-related disorders. You can also have laboratory experiments, but the naturalistic studies are, of course, more interesting for work-related issues. Now let's have a look. What do we know about the evidence of a link between work stress and depression? This is an important study coming from Finland, and it shows in the upper part of the curve an elevated risk of disability pension due to depression in a large group of male and female employees in Finland, and you can see those with the highest level of effort and reward imbalance have an almost twice as high hazard ratio, relative risk, almost twice as high, 1.9, risk of suffering from depression compared to those without stress. Although impressive, this is just one study. But let's go on. Another study enabled us to look at the correlation, at the association between work stress and depressive symptoms among elderly workers, actually in 3 continents. We had comparable data on the work stress models of at least the component of load control in the demand control model, and also on effort reward imbalance. And you can see 2 colors, a blue color which describes the effort reward imbalance model, and a dark color which describes the component of load control in the demand control model. And in all 3 continents, older workers suffer more from depressive symptoms if they are experiencing high effort and low reward or low control at work. And these risks are more than twice as high in the USA. They are about twice as high for effort-reward imbalance in Europe, a little bit less for low control, and they are also significantly elevated in Japan, at least for the effort-reward imbalance model. So you can see, in all three continents, all elderly workers suffering from work stress in terms of these two models have an elevated risk of depressive symptoms compared to those without work stress. Next. ARAÚJO and her team were able to study the work stress model of effort-reward imbalance in the context of a famous Brazilian study, the so-called ELSA Brazil study, in more than 10,000 employed people. And you can see, this is, however, it should be mentioned, this is a cross-sectional study. This is not a prospective study, so it shows the prevalence ratio. However, as you can see, each component of the model, high effort, low reward, and high overcommitment, are associated with a substantially increased prevalence ratio of suffering from depression in this Brazilian study. And again, if you combine high effort and low reward, the risk is more than twice as high to suffer from depression. Next slide shows that there are many studies now, after 30 years of research, which have produced results. And these results are summarized in so-called systematic reviews. And in systematic reviews, you can also conduct a meta-analysis where you pull the risk estimates of the single studies together, and where you show that a number of studies together provide an elevated risk. So you can see in the first slide, in the first upper part, you can see that at least for 14 studies, the job demand control model has been tested with regard to the risk of depression, and pulled together an elevated of 74% of depression has been documented among those suffering from high demand and low control, compared to those without stress. And rather below you can see that at least 8 studies testing the effort-reward imbalance model have found around 50 to 70% increase of the pooled risk estimate for this kind of stress at work compared to the non-stressed population. And the third model, which I did not focus on in this presentation, has also provided some results, although the number of studies is less high. A more recent, next slide please, a more recent systematic reviews has also distinguished the relative risk between men and women. And for L is men and for W is women. And you can see there are some but not substantial differences between men and women. So the suffering from work stress among women can be well compared to the suffering of men among men if they experience work stress. And if you look at the studies below, a very recent one study from Canada, published 2 years ago, have again shown a 73% increased risk of effort-reward imbalance at work. So it seems this model is really relevant for the prediction of depression. Next. We can summarize that many studies from different countries document significantly elevated risks of depression ranging about 50 to 70% increased risk. And even a modest increase of relative risks is an important fact, because almost every fourth worker, about 25% of all employed women and men, are suffering either from high-demand, low-control jobs or from working conditions characterized by high effort and low reward. So even a risk elevation of about 50% is relevant if this elevation concerns 25% of the whole working population. And you could even estimate how many cases of depression could be prevented if you were able, which is obviously unrealistic, but if you were able to escape from stressful work, if there were no high job demand, low job control jobs, and low high effort, low reward jobs, you could prevent almost every fourth depressive episode within employed population. So this is theoretically a very significant contribution to the disease burden among population. And this burden of disease is also important because it's not restricted to depression. It is equally high for coronary heart disease, and unfortunately people with depression have also a higher risk of coronary heart disease, what we call in science the so-called comorbidity. So the comorbidity risk of coronary heart disease and depression is also about twice as high compared to those without depression. Again, you can see how important stressful work is for employed populations. Next. Well, this is just a simple recent figure which shows that if you combine the two work stress models and look for a small group of employees who simultaneously suffer from high demand, low control, and from high effort and low reward, then you can see the risk is elevated. It's almost twice as high compared to those without work stress. So combining the two models additionally increases the risk. But the next slide shows, importantly, that people with lower socioeconomic positions might have a higher vulnerability, a higher susceptibility to suffer from these both stressful working conditions. The upper part is an example of a study showing this higher vulnerability for coronary heart disease. This is a study from the United Kingdom where clerical civil servants had the highest risk of suffering from coronary heart disease compared to the risk in higher positions like professionals or the highest position of administrative civil servants, where the effect of effort-reward imbalance on heart disease was not statistically significant. It was statistically significant in the lowest socio-economic group. And the lower part shows the same for depression. It's only the combination of high effort-reward imbalance and low socio-economic position which produces a very high statistically significant effect on the risk of depression. More than twice as high elevated risk among low working people suffering from work stress in terms of this model. So I think I won't have time to go into more details about the chronic psychosocial stress experience and development of depression. You can see there are links established by biomedical basic research. Next slide, I will not have time to show you. There are some experimental studies which document that people suffering from work stress have lower level of immune responses in the body, such as natural killer cells. You can see on the left-hand side, for men, a significantly lower amount of natural killer cells among men suffering from high effort and low reward compared to the men with low effort and reward imbalance. And on the right-hand side, you can see a small, non-significant effect also among women. So I will not have time to go into details, but let's move to the third dimension. Next slide, please. To the third dimension of my talk. Just the next. Okay? Yes. To the implementation of this new evidence for intervention strategies. We talk about prevention at 3 levels: personal, interpersonal, and structural level. And we talk about rehabilitation, in particular return to work and vocational support. So let's first focus at the personal level. Why is prevention at the personal level an important topic? To prevent stress through measures of relaxation, of improved coping skills, and of better health behavior. Next slide. You think, okay, yes, thank you. I think if you monitor the stressful psychosocial work environment among employees in companies, you can generate awareness. You can generate evidence for stakeholders. You can show by figures that there are real problems. You can demonstrate work-related difficulties and challenges, have a quantitative, a credible amount of evidence in your company. So you may motivate and urge stakeholders to take some preventive activities. Therefore, establishing regular psychosocial and health-related screenings in companies represent an important first step. Of course, this is not easy, because implementing these screenings as a routine and to enforce participation, this requires the cooperation from employers, employee organizations, and occupational health professionals. But there are several nations and several countries where a national legislation offers even the necessity to conduct this kind of regular yearly monitoring of psychosocial work. I don't know the situation in Brazil, but there are several countries, not only in Europe, also in Eastern Asia, like Japan and South Korea, where such legislations exist. Next. So we have shown a couple of years ago, together with Diego Montero and colleagues, we have shown that unfortunately efforts which would be helpful for those at the bottom of society, those in the worst working conditions, and these are people in the black parts of the columns indicated in these slides, they are less frequently served with primary prevention measures like consultations how to reduce your overweight, with consultations on how to eat fruit and vegetables, to eat healthy food, And as you can see, those who suffer most from musculoskeletal symptoms, those in higher moral positions, they have very rarely get instructions about how to cope with musculoskeletal diseases. And also stress-related courses of relaxation and coping with stress is not often presented to low stress, to low socioeconomic position workers. So paradoxically, those with the highest work-related frustration are least often confronted with this kind of individual level preventive measures provided by the companies. This is a result from the many randomized controlled trials which have been published over the last few years and which have been analyzed in our group. So there's much to be done, even at this level. The second level is the level of interpersonal prevention. And this is exactly the way where managers and leaders should be confronted with the need of improving their behavior at work. And how? This should be done by promoting a regular flow of information and communication. Leaders and managers should share information across employees, and they should avoid dysfunctional barriers of communication. Improved leadership is needed, where authentic leaders motivate the co-workers rather than just controlling and punishing them. So they should integrate task orientation with relationship orientation. And most importantly, participation and teamwork should be strengthened. The third level, next slide. The third level, and probably the most important but also most difficult level, is the level of organizational changes. It is important to improve the working time management, to reduce excessive working hours, to increase the flexibility of work schedules, and to allow employees to participate in decision-making about work schedules. It is important to reduce work intensity and to comply with the regulations of work hours and work duration and intensity. It is important to strengthen the job task control by enriching job tasks, by enabling job rotation, and by enlarging the decision latitude among job tasks. It is equally important to promote fairness, reward, and appreciation at work, to avoid discrimination, violation, and corruption, to offer a fair wage, to enable people to promote if they are motivated and engaged and able and capable, to promote them, to develop, to enable their development at the professional level, and also to create a culture of appropriate appreciation and support. And finally, next slide. Let's go to the next slide. I simply want to show, maybe we can have this slide. I simply want to show that there are already some practical implementations of the work stress models we are talking about. For instance, in Canada, in the Quebec province, there has been the implementation of so-called standards of management practices to reduce low reward, to increase high effort and low reward at work. And you can see that those few companies which already implemented these practices, this is the T1 in this slide, compared to the the T1 in the second row without implementation, that they were able to reduce low reward over a certain period of time, I think 4 years. So they were able to significantly reduce the prevalence of low reward in their work, in their companies. And at the same time, they were also able to reduce significantly the level of high distress among their employees. And the red figures at the right-hand side show that these are significant reductions of significant net effects of their intervention. So actually you can do something with these theoretical models. Next. So there's also a need at the national level of labor market and social policies. I think it is important to go beyond the level of single organizations and to address the national policy level, which is a political dimension, of course. It is important to strengthen the so-called active labor market policies, which are policies to increase the integration of those without work into work, but also to increase return to work among those, for instance, with high depression. It is also important to develop protective policies, the so-called passive protective policies. These are policies of generosity and accessibility of benefit programs where the income loss among those who are no longer able to go to work are compensated, where disability pensions are provided to those who are no longer at work. So it is important to improve the legislation on employment contract, and it is very important to enforce fair work standards, including occupational health and safety measures, not only in terms of injury prevention, in terms of reducing health hazards related to shift work and related to long working hours. It is also equally important to enforce fair work standards with regard to the work stress models of high demand, low control, high effort, and low reward. Finally, next. Let's go on next. It is also important to improve the relevance of return to work following depression, RTV, return to work policy. Improve the legal prescription to employers to reintegrate sick employees step by step with reduced working hours and with sickness funds which compensate for lost wages and salaries for a certain time. And we already know from research there are factors of successful reintegration, and these factors include early onset, as provided by the so-called individual placement and support programs. These factors of successful reintegration include targeted individual counseling at work, home-tailored psychotherapy, modification and adaptation of the demands and also of the work schedule, and also supportive social climate, not only from superiors but also from colleagues. If you follow these factors, you are rather successful in reintegrating depressive people into work again. Next and final. Now let's go to this slide. And this slide, no, let's show the slide before. Yes. No, the next one. Yeah, thank you. And this slide shows that this is again from European countries, and it includes, it is certain European countries. And the Organization of Economic Development, OECD, has created for every nation of its members a so-called Index of Labor Market Integration. And we have used this Index of Labor Market Integration for all 13 European countries in these studies. And what you can see is a association or a correlation, but it's based on a more sophisticated statistical model between the amount of integration of this labor integration index provided by OECD and the number of work stress and the strengths of work stress, the low work stress experienced among employees in these countries. And this work stress data have been collected by the so-called Survey of Health and Employment in Aging Population in Europe, the so-called SHARE study. So you can see there's a straight line. Those countries with a very poor integration index of labor market integration have also the highest level of effort-reward imbalance. And these are Eastern European countries like Poland, Czechia, and also Southern European countries like Italy, Greece, and Spain. On the other hand, Northwestern countries like Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Netherlands, Austria, they have the lowest level of work stress, but also the highest amount of labor market integration policies at the national level. So in conclusion, this is my last slide. In conclusion, we can say depression in working age population is a serious public health problem. It deserves wide recognition, and it calls for substantial investments into prevention and treatment. Secondly, the current scientific evidence of working conditions as a determinant of depression is quite robust, and it is really far advanced after 30 years of international research. And this new knowledge, mainly based on the two work stress models demonstrated, can instruct policies and strategies of prevention and rehabilitation. However, and this is particularly important message for you, the deep gap still exists between the scientific state of art on the one hand and the awareness, information and motivation among stakeholders, decision makers and the wider public on the other hand. And measures to reduce this gap between scientific knowledge and awareness and motivation to act against this state of the art. Measures to reduce this gap are of primary importance. So, professionals in occupational health, employers, trade unions, governments, and the wider public, and of course, associations as your National Observatory on Mental Health. These all are important target groups which need to be activated to improve information, education, and motivation to act, and to develop joint initiatives to improve healthy working conditions and to improve mental health among working life populations. I very much hope that my contribution has helped to motivate you to continue your very important efforts, and I want to thank you for your interest in this contribution. Many thanks. Okay.
Muito Muito obrigada, professor Johannes. Estamos aqui muito felizes e, ao mesmo tempo, né, o quadro que você nos apresenta e que também está na nossa realidade mostra que essa sua fala final, né, de motivação para atuar é extremamente importante. Então, eu queria te agradecer. Acho que mesmo com o avançar das horas, a gente poderia ter 2 questões, se você puder nos atender para responder o público. Quero aproveitar para também agradecer, não somente por essa conferência aqui, Johannes, mas principalmente pelas suas décadas de anos de trabalho dedicado a produzir evidências, né, do ambiente psicossocial do trabalho e seus efeitos negativos sobre a saúde das pessoas, no intuito de mudar, né, reconfigurar esse trabalho para termos um trabalho que seja motivador, que nos traga alegria, que nos traga convivência, né, ao invés de termos sofrimento, adoecimento. Então, a sua contribuição para a gente mudar isso é muito importante. Então, eu acho que gostaria de deixar também registrado esse agradecimento. É uma vida, né, gente? É uma vida. O Johannes já tem 80 anos e ele está aqui, né, batalhando. Então, queria também dizer que foi mencionado, né, a necessidade de reduzir as horas de trabalho e a jornada semanal, SIEGRIST. Eu queria te dizer que aqui no Brasil a gente tem uma jornada, né, regulamentada de trabalhar 6 dias e ter somente 1 para descanso. Mas nesse momento a gente está com um grande movimento incorporado pelo presidente Lula, inclusive, de redução dessa jornada de trabalho para 5x2 ou 4x3. Então, espero em breve te dar notícias de que a gente conseguiu reduzir aí essa jornada de trabalho. Bom, eu teria então tempo para 1 ou 2 perguntas. A pessoa precisa vir falar no microfone para que o Bruno possa traduzir para o professor Johannes. Quem gostaria? Eliane. Teria mais uma. Se alguém puder, já vem para fazer a pergunta aqui, por favor. Sim, por favor. Ok. Eliane, por favor. Eliane Kleber. Pode ser em português.
Bom dia, professor. Gostaria de agradecer pela brilhante palestra. Nós aqui no Brasil, como a professora TΑNIA trouxe, estamos tentando, de alguma maneira, nos contrapormos a essas condições adversas que fazem com que não consigamos, talvez, tão brevemente as transformações que almejamos. Eu gostei muito quando o senhor traz a possibilidade de uma discussão profunda com as empresas, para que elas possam, de fato, compreender a necessidade de olharem para os riscos psicossociais, porque eu acho que hoje elas não querem olhar, né? Olhar vai ter um custo imenso, e isso tem desafiado, inclusive, o nosso governo de pressionar a essas empresas para que possam, de fato, começarem a atuar e diminuir o sofrimento dos trabalhadores. Então, eu gostaria, se possível, que o senhor nos trouxesse aqui quais têm sido as estratégias efetivas para que nós possamos nos contrapor ao que um dos teóricos mais jovens aqui no Brasil, Vladimir Safatli, fala sobre uma engenharia social neoliberal que faz com que todas as regras do trabalho se coloquem a favor do capital. Então, de que maneira é que a gente pode se contrapor a essa macroestrutura que determina hoje o que as empresas têm feito aos nossos trabalhadores? Obrigada.
Obrigada, Eliane. Kleber, por favor. Johannes, do you listen to us?
Yes, but I didn't understand, of course.
Eu ouvi, mas eu não.
Excuse me, I think this is Bruno is not translating to English.
No. I didn't hear.
Venha falar aqui, Bruno.
Can you summarize the question for me in English?
Just a moment. Bruno, por favor.
Se eu falo, a minha voz sai para todo mundo. Então vai subir pra
Okay,
voz
we
de quem
have
tá
one
fazendo a
second
pergunta.
question in English, please.
Eu posso anotar a pergunta e fazer para ele em seguida.
Venha falar aqui, ó.
Here? Aqui também dá para falar. Can you understand me? Can you hear me?
Can you just summarize the
Eu
question?
falo, sai para todo mundo. Agora. Isso. Mas aí vai sair a pergunta que está sendo feita e a minha voz ele não vai conseguir ouvir. Tomar então. Assim.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. It's a pleasure to hear you. And was a very high epidemiology, occupational epidemiology lecture. My question is, how can we implement the necessary actions in low-income countries when we often lack the resource to conduct our own research and high-income countries seem increasingly reluctant or decreasing our provide fundings? Because you showed a lot of studies, or maybe just one from Brazil, and we have no idea about Africa countries or poor countries. And what is your opinion, and how can we measure with this problem nowadays? Então eu perguntei para ele, traduziu lá? Tudo bem?
Thank you for this question. I am fully aware that developing research and implementing the findings of research into practice are highly challenging jobs for researchers and also for the wider community. This is not only the case in low-income countries, it is also the case, for instance, in Europe, and right now, evidently in the highest developed country in the USA, where research is currently being threatened. So scientific collaboration across countries is a very important contribution. And I'm very glad that it has been possible to develop a link between Brazil and Germany in terms of the ERI model, for instance, with the contributions of TΑNIA, ARAÚJO, and also with other colleagues. And I think it is our duty from the more developed, economically developed countries to offer you collaboration and also to learn from your own experience, which may be different from our experience, but to contribute, to strengthen the cooperation. Unfortunately, research resources are limited. Even we are struggling very heavily to continue our research as well. And I know it's even much more difficult in Brazil. But nevertheless, I think scientific exchange and collaboration is an important step. And for instance, there are international associations like the networks of the International Community of Occupational Health, ICO. There are international committees for different diseases. And in these committees, there's a very strong exchange and collaboration, in particular between developed and developing countries. My own experience is mostly with the ICO group on cardiovascular health, and there are quite strong links to Asian countries. So I think for Brussels it would be an opportunity to look for extensive collaboration through international societal associations like ICO and others.
Obrigada, SIEGRIST. Eu penso que a questão anterior era muito complexa.
The question before was quite complex.
I think this
Then
is a Eliane perguntou pouco como que estratégias nós poderíamos estabelecer para transformar essa lógica capitalista num mundo tão complexo como hoje. Algumas estratégias de luta que você pensa que a gente poderia trilhar.
Não sei se consegui.
Eu acho que é essa questão que ela trouxe.
That would be the questions she asked.
You understand, this is more a comment than a question.
Eu acho que sim. Sim, ela estava querendo saber o que você pensa sobre possíveis estratégias para a gente lidar com essa situação complexa do domínio capitalista atual.
The capitalistic domination we have nowadays.
Really, I mean, these two work stress models were developed in times when we did not yet have economic globalization, where we did not yet have artificial intelligence and digitalization of work, and where we did not yet have this kind of extensive capitalist development by transnational corporations. So the current economic and work conditions are quite different from the ones which were prevalent when we developed our work stress models. And it may be that we need to revise and to adapt the work stress model to capture the current threats and the current challenges of health, detrimental work and employment conditions more clearly. We are already in a process of improving our analysis. For instance, we focus now more clearly on non-standard work, on precarious work and employment conditions, rather than stable positions, which were more prevalent 40, 30 years ago. So flexible work and more insecure work is now prevalent, and I think this provides new need to update the knowledge, but also new need to develop intervention measures.
O mundo está aí, a gente está precisando transformá-lo, não é, SIEGRIST? Vamos em frente. Bom, gostaria de agradecer por esse seu tempo que cedeu, que nós combinamos. Então, me desculpe, mas a gente não poderia perder essa oportunidade de tê-lo aqui conosco. Muito obrigada. Até a próxima vez. Vamos continuar em colaboração. Em nome de todos aqui, muito obrigada, professor SIEGRIST.
Okay, thank you. Thank you as well. Okay.
Bye, 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 bye.
Bye, bye. Bye, bye. Okay, bye, bye.